In today's webinar, we'll begin with a brief introduction to offshore wind energy in the United States, and then we will dive into the basics of offshore wind's community impacts. Then we'll engage in a panel discussion on these topics. So we'll begin with the context that about 2 years ago, the Biden administration set a target of installing 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. To reach this target, the administration made commitments to supporting the deployment of offshore wind projects that will create well-paying unionized jobs, providing investments into infrastructure to support a domestic supply chain, and supporting critical research and development and data sharing. NREL researchers have found that there are enough planned offshore wind projects in the pipeline to reach that 30 gigawatt goal by 2030, which is great news. Right now in the United States, there's research and development work underway to begin deploying offshore wind in all 4 major bodies of water: the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Great Lakes. We currently only have 42 megawatts of operating offshore wind across 2 projects, the Block Island Wind Farm near Block Island in Rhode Island, and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project off the coast of Virginia, but that's about to change because there are 21 new projects expected to be constructed off the Atlantic coast in the next 5 years. 2 of those projects, Vineyard Wind 1 off the coast of Martha's Vineyard and South Fork Wind off the eastern tip of Long Island, are currently under construction and expected to be completed later this year. For a long time, the focus has been on the Atlantic coast, but we now have other emerging regions to consider as well. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management hosted its first California lease auction in December 2022, so offshore wind developers now hold leases on the West Coast. BOEM then announced in February of this year that it is beginning to plan a future lease auction for offshore wind development in the Gulf of Mexico. So now that we have this foundational understanding of where we are hoping to go with offshore wind, we will hone in on offshore wind and communities. It's important to understand that most utility scale offshore wind projects will be constructed in federal waters, and most projects will be sited around 15 to 20 miles from shore. However, there are still impacts to communities both on land and at sea from these projects. There's no single standard definition of what communities will be impacted by offshore wind and how they will be impacted. These concepts will vary depending on factors like the project size and location and the type of impact. Before offshore wind stakeholders and decision makers can take any actions on community impacts, it's important to be collaborative and engage communities to better understand how a community identifies itself and what types of impacts they may experience. Because communities are not monolithic, any discussion of community impacts should be approached with sensitivity and take into account place-based considerations that are specific to a given community. It's also important to note that impact tends to have a negative connotation, but we know that offshore wind can have positive, negative, or neutral impacts on communities. So we use this word to refer to both the flow of benefits or positive effects to communities and the flow of burdens or negative effects to communities. So there are a diverse array of communities and people that may be impacted by offshore wind. And this list is not exhaustive by any means, but some communities that may be considered impacted by offshore wind include people working in industries that are affected by offshore wind, such as fishing, tourism, and manufacturing, people who have shared heritage and may live nearby offshore wind development or have historical and cultural ties to impacted areas, such as tribal communities, communities that are party to a host community agreement or community benefit agreement with a developer. There are also onshore communities that may be affected by supply chain infrastructure like ports or by grid infrastructure like cable landings. And finally, there are island or coastal communities that may live in close proximity to a project. For example, the Block Island Wind Farm is sited in state waters close to Block Island. It's also important to note that these can be overlapping. For example, people working in the fishing industry may live near a port, and tribes may be considered host communities by developers. So now we'll talk about some of the specific impacts offshore wind can have. And I'll preface this again by saying this list is meant to be an introduction and is not representative of all types of impacts. So there can be economic and workforce impacts such as job creation and workforce development and training. There can be opportunities for businesses in the supply chain and other economic impacts from supply chain activities like manufacturing, impacts to industries that use the ocean such as fishing and tourism, and economic benefits such as benefit agreements and property taxes. There are also potential environmental impacts like impacts to the marine environment from vessels and project construction and operations. Local air quality may be impacted negatively by supply chain activities and vessels, but it may also be impacted positively from reduced use of fossil fuels for electricity generation. So there may also be onshore infrastructure such as new or modified port facilities and other supply chain facilities like factories. Due to their large size, offshore wind turbines will mostly be assembled at coastal ports. So we are seeing development of these ports on both the east and west coast right now. Another form of onshore infrastructure is cable landings and other grid infrastructure needed to carry power from offshore wind projects to the onshore grid. Visual impacts are another consideration, whether that is impacts to views from shore or from boats. Views of turbines may look different depending on time of day and vantage point as well. Finally, there are a variety of cultural impacts that may come from offshore wind, such as impacts to cultural, historical, or tribal resources. Communities may also see changes to the ways that the ocean has historically been used, or to the way a port or coastal area has been used. And finally, there may be an influx of new businesses, tourists, investment, taxes, and other new influences within a community. These influences and their induced effects may be a mixture of negative and positive impacts for many communities. So many of the impacts of offshore wind will be positive, but some of them may also be considered negative by communities. When negative impacts have been identified, stakeholders like developers and governments can take different approaches to addressing them, such as avoiding impacts or minimizing them by making different project planning decisions, mitigating impacts that can't be avoided, which, for example, could look like taking actions to restore a marine environment that was affected negatively, and compensation, which might look like providing financial compensation to an impacted community. State and federal government agencies have different standard processes in place for evaluating and addressing impacts. One example is that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management considers economic and environmental impacts during its process for leasing offshore wind project sites. Developers must engage in stringent environmental studies and monitoring, as well as conducting economic impact studies and meet BOEM standards in order to build a project. Efforts to address impacts can take place anywhere from the federal to the local level. For example, there's a cooperative effort underway between 11 East Coast states to set up a regional fund to compensate fishermen for negative impacts from offshore wind. On the local level, one example is that the offshore wind port being developed in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, is required by a community benefit agreement to be zero emission per the request of the local community. One last thing to consider on this topic is that benefits and negative impacts are often in relationship with each other. For example, a regional fisheries compensation fund and a zero emission port facility are both benefits that are given as a way to avoid or compensate for negative impacts. And now that we've gone over some of the foundational aspects of offshore wind and community impacts, I will introduce our panelist and moderator. Our first panelist is Dr. Allison Bates, who is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. Dr. Bates researches social acceptance of renewable energy systems and implements an equity and justice framework to inform decision-making in the energy transition. She has worked on national energy policy with US Senator Coons to develop markets and policies for renewable energy infrastructure along the coast, and served in an advisory role with energy markets planning in Maine with state agencies, non-governmental organizations, and industry. She earned her PhD in marine policy at the University of Delaware Center for Carbon-Free Power Integration and has many years of experience in the nonprofit sector for environmental education and public land conservation. Our next panelist is Benjamin Gallinelli, who is Vice President of the Southern New Jersey Development Council, or SNJDC, a nonprofit organization charged with promoting responsible economic growth for the southern 8 counties of New Jersey. Ben directs SNJDC's communications, outreach, and advocacy activities that impact the business community and advance economic development in the South Jersey region. Ben is also the project director for SNJDC's diversity, inclusion, and local engagement efforts on behalf of construction manager AECOM Tishman for the New Jersey Wind Port project in Lower Alloways Creek, Salem County. Our third panelist is Jacob Miller, who is a Vineyard Offshore tribal liaison. He works to build and maintain collaborative relationships with tribal governments and members of tribal nations. Jacob most recently worked as a senior policy advisor and community development director in the office of Massachusetts State Senator Mark Montigny. He has worked as a union organizer with the Greater Southeastern Massachusetts Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and a grassroots coordinator with Opportunity Nation. Jacob holds a bachelor's in political science and English from the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, a master's in management from the University of Cambridge, and a master's in building and urban design and development from the University College London. He is currently completing his Juris Doctor degree at UMass Law. And finally, I will introduce our moderator, who is NREL's own Suzanne McDonald. Suzanne is a senior researcher at NREL, where she supports stakeholder engagement initiatives in offshore and land-based wind, as well as other community-led energy transition programs. She has nearly 20 years of experience supporting communities to navigate complex change, most recently at the Maine-based Island Institute. Suzanne has been working alongside communities on offshore wind since 2009, supporting benefit negotiations, facilitating communities of practice, developing case studies, and integrating equity into state and national initiatives. She holds degrees in policy and international and urban community development, and she lives with her family in a fishing community in Mid-Coast, Maine. And now I will pass things off to Suzanne with the reminder that you can post questions using Zoom's Q&A function throughout this panel, and they'll be answered either during or after the webinar.
Great, thanks Matilda, and welcome again everybody. It's really wonderful to be able to dive into this discussion with you all. The way this is going to work is we'll go through some opening comments and questions from me to all of our panelists. And then as Matilda said, as you have questions, please use the Q&A chat function. I'll work those in as best I can, and then we'll reserve some time towards the end to cover any of the questions that haven't been answered already. So I want to thank everybody for joining us as panelists today. Like Matilda said, this topic can be very large depending on how you want to define it. And I think I do just want to acknowledge that we are not seeking to be fully comprehensive in our discussion of this topic here today. We know there are lots of different perspectives and lived experiences, some of which we're bringing to the discussion, and other perspectives that we're looking forward to covering in future webinars. So really excited about the group of experts that we've brought in into this discussion today. And I'm just going to kick us off by asking each of them to add anything else they want to their introductions from Matilda, and let us know why they're drawn to this topic. What do they find most compelling about the idea of communities, offshore wind, and local impacts? Allison, maybe I'll put you on the spot first, and we'll go to Ben and then Jacob.
Sure. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you, everyone who's here for participating. I guess I would just add that I've actually worked in a number of regions that are currently facing offshore wind development. I've worked on the West Coast, I've worked in the Mid-Atlantic, and most recently here in the Northeast. I grew up in a maritime family, spent a lot of time on Penobscot Bay, and it's been really fascinating returning to this region for this type of work. And I think what's most interesting for me is when we talk about offshore wind and some of the barriers, for so many years, we focused on either cost or the technical limitations and technical development. But from my perspective, it's really about the people. And that's what's going to lead us to either be successful or not in achieving some of our energy targets. So I'm really excited that NREL is putting on this great webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Ben?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me on here. I guess the only thing I would really add is that, you know, there's a lot of interest in our region on this. I grew up in South Jersey, and you know, it's exciting. It's very exciting times with this new industry that's being stood up here. Our work often has us kind of in a one-track, one-lane process, you know, working on the wind port specifically, and you know, finding local businesses and whatnot. So I'm actually interested to hear some of my fellow panelists, their perspectives and sharing on this webinar as well. So I can even learn a little bit and take something from this as well. So thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Ben. Jacob?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. Thank you to everyone, you know, my fellow panelists, and for the folks that are here today and listening in the future. I appreciate it. I'm a New Bedford boy, born and raised. And you know, it's really exciting to see what's happening here in my city, and I'm excited to share some of those lessons learned and things that we've done as a company, and then also engagement I had before. But I also think it's important to recognize where we're situated. You know, we're on the lands of the Wampanoag people here in New Bedford, and I'm also excited to talk a little bit about my work and some best practices and knowledge I've learned from working collaboratively with our tribal partners and tribal governments. So thank you all.
Great, thanks. So one of the things we're excited about is that we do have a diversity of perspectives, from research to industry to local economic development interests. But at the crux of today's conversation is this discussion of community. And I feel like I've spent the better part of 20 years talking to people about what is community? How do you define community? And in the context of offshore wind, as Matilda said, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. And so we'd love to hear from each of you first, how you're seeing folks navigate that tricky sort of proposition of defining community in the context of offshore wind. Allison, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure, happy to. You know, this is actually a really tricky question, because when we talk about community, I think that people who may not live in that space often define community in a geographic scale.
So we might think of a region, we might think of a state, we might think of a town, or something even more granular. But we certainly know that community is much more nuanced than that. And I sometimes think about community as like a collection of people who may feel like they're in this together. When I am working in communities, I often hear people referring to their communities in maybe familial ways. Sometimes it's generational. As we might be thinking about, historic use of an area or preserving something for a future generation. So there's very strong familial connections. And we might also think about community in a group of people that might be impacted in a similar way. So when we talk about fishing community, that's such a broad term that doesn't really encompass the nuances of maybe inshore or offshore communities, or people who are lobstering versus boats that are dragging, small boats that maybe are just one person, maybe there's no crew, versus very large boats. So those distinctions become really important because the impacts are distributed in very different ways. I think that we're learning more about how to do this. I think one of the ways to be more successful in defining community is to work with local organizations that can help define that at the community level. Because I think when we think about either government or industry coming into a community and trying to define what that community is, it's always going to be fraught because there are going to be people missed. And I don't think there's a easy answer to how we define community, but I think that one of the ways that we should be thinking about doing this is identifying important social actors that can help bring people to the table. And I think that's one of the ways that we can more successfully identify communities in any given region. And I guess I would also just say that when it comes to offshore wind, these are large projects. We often look at wind energy areas in very large spatial scales. We look at the whole New England region and talk about New England or the South Shore or Mid-Atlantic, but community impacts are highly localized and community connections are also hyperlocal. So it makes it very difficult to identify community or community issues in advance before we have a lot of knowledge about location of a wind farm. So it's a really difficult thing to answer.
And I guess maybe I'll pass that over to either Ben or Jake if they have other thoughts about this. I know both of you are working at the community scale.
I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll jump in. To say that I agree with everything that with your analysis of it, and it's true. It's really difficult to define. But where my mind went, and this is both in my New Bedford work and the work with tribal nations and our tribal partners is trust. So much of community is matching that interest, which the interest of the whole country technically is part of the community affected by offshore wind. And then how do we as an industry or as federal agencies or local community partners that are really excited about it, how do we go about building trust-based relationships where we can have hard conversations and engage meaningfully about this real solution to the real issue of climate change. So that's where my mind went, but I agree with everything that you said.
Yeah, and I too would just echo Jacob's sentiment on Allison's response. It really is tricky, and it really is kind of difficult, especially in South Jersey, where we're doing this work on the wind port. There's a direct impact, right? There's a direct impact to the community where this construction's happening, and with all large infrastructure projects, there's disruptions and there's issues that come and go. But the offshore wind is a very large industry that's going to overlap into multiple communities. And, it's not the scope of South Jersey is kind of large geographically, but really, we especially as an organization, kind of view South Jersey as one broad community, essentially. So, while there may be impacts occurring locally, whether it's in Lower Allies Creek or whether you're talking about some of the shore communities with some of the, onshore transmission construction and whatnot, I mean, it's all kind of relative, I guess. The impacts that are happening here really do kind of overlap and bleed into the other communities as well.
That's great. Well, I know it's a tricky question, but I think you all did a really great job of addressing it. I love the idea of having like a timescale or temporal component. So community, sometimes we talk about geography as one sort of obvious piece, but that sort of vested interest in the past and the future is something I've definitely seen distinguish some of the work I've done. When you care about, impacts to resources and significance that have been generational in the past, but also being really focused on like, what is this 20-year, plan, or what does decommissioning look like? It means that you have that vested interest in the future as well. And maybe that's a component of community that I'm not sure we chat too much about. So that's really great to hear. So let's dive into some of your perspectives on the communities in which you work. Jacob, I'm going to start off with you as a self-professed New Bedford boy. New Bedford is on the map for many different reasons, and really in many ways is a trailblazer for this industry in the United States, as one of the first port communities in the country. And so would love just your reflections on how you've seen impact sort of show up in that positive or negative or neutral sense in New Bedford in the industry thus far. And how do you think that that's going to change over time?
Yeah, absolutely. There was the state made a very big gamble here in New Bedford, many years ago by building the Marine Commerce Terminal. And that gamble is paying off with components coming into the port even today. And New Bedford historically, was once the city that lit the world with whale oil, and now is the city that will hopefully be leading the charge on lighting the world again, with clean energy and with sustainably sourced energy. So I think that there's a narrative arc here in the city that's also that isn't as explored, but I think is also really important to why some of these investments were made and why some of the leadership at the state level that was taken. But I think that now that, I bet this is the same for many communities of, is this real? People have been talking about it for decades, or, going back to Cape Wind. So it's been really hard, going back to my trust comment, for to engage people as it was developing in the earlier years. But even when every day is almost 10 years lost in getting somebody into the workforce or into some of those other challenges and getting them into trainings. I'll just share real quick a personal experience I had before coming into this role. Was I created a offshore wind youth exchange program between Grimsby in the UK, which is the host of the world's largest offshore wind farm, owned by Ørsted, and here in New Bedford. And bringing the New Bedford kids to Grimsby, they got to see what it looked like to have a facility in their community. And I think that those are the types of things, seeing for folks, especially in communities like mine, seeing is believing. And so now that people are seeing it, the excitement is there. People really want to get engaged. When the first ships came through the hurricane barrier here, I was getting texts and calls from my own friends being like, how do I get a job now? So it's, there's this need to be tangible to something that, once it's constructed, many of us won't see it because it's so far away. So I think that, now as we're charting that path forward, using us as an example in other communities, I think will be, to say it's real, it's happening. I think that that'll really be helpful. And then I could also later on talk about some of our more intricate partnerships with different organizations on training and different things. But that's the broad brush answer.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. Ben, give us some perspective on your work in working with communities in New Jersey, particularly around the wind port development. What are you hearing in terms of how people are thinking about impact, either positive or negative?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Jacob was saying there, and echo again. There is like a notion of excitement, significant interest and a palpable excitement, I think is a fair word to say. We specifically engage with a lot of the local businesses on opportunities for this project, the construction that's happening right now. And, the community itself, there's a lot of local business that can engage in various levels, whether we're talking about a prime contractor, a subcontractor, or even just, a small local printing supply company that, can provide services to one of the contractors on the field. There's a lot of interest and engagement for those opportunities. And then on a larger community scale, I guess you could say that, the potential workforce development opportunities that will be coming once the port facility is up and running with the manufacturing and the marshaling opportunities. There's a lot of interest in our region on, you know, pathways and how to get involved in, you know, what's coming, this new industry that's being stood up here.
That's great. Thank you. Allison, your work, some of your work, I know to be focused on a community definition that's maybe a little bit different here. We talk about communities at sea and communities on land in terms of the fishing communities. And I think, you know, both you and I being based here in Maine, where we have some of the largest amount of commercial fishing activity right in the same areas where offshore wind development is being considered, that's a topic that comes up a lot here. But I think sometimes we think about these issues as separate. There's the communities at sea and the communities at land, on land. And I know some of your work has been to consider the importance of the connection between the two, how folks working on the water have connections back on land. And so would love to just get your reflections on any differences or similarities that you see between the impacts between offshore and onshore communities, and how do you see that connection, the potential for, I guess, maybe a trickle down impact or whatnot from offshore to onshore communities?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Suzanne. What's happening, I think, around ports and infrastructure and on land is a little different up here in Maine and in the Gulf of Maine, as we're in a different stage. We're still identifying lease areas. And I think that these conversations haven't quite taken on the level of excitement yet. I think there's still a lot of trepidation. And there's a very significant amount of our workforce that's highly dependent as on kind of an offshore community. You know, we often talk about offshore communities as people that are working on the waterfront and working out on vessels and very invested in the marine trades, that see something very tangible that's potentially to lose and certainly possibilities to gain. But I think a lot of the conversation right now is around, well, you know, what are the potential losses and how is that going to trickle onto land-based communities? And I do think that the impacts are a little bit different. I think, you know, offshore, it's often about spatial use, who has the rights, who has access to these areas. But I think rights and access and use of ocean areas is not just about economics of, let's say, where fish are caught, where some sort of economic activity is taking place. It's also about the cultural and historic connections to those families, and is very strong, the intergenerational component to this. This really does trickle to land-based communities because we're making a lot of decisions on land about where to invest in new vessels, in supply chain, in infrastructure that might be ancillary to fishing or working waterfront communities, such as ice facilities, seafood processors, and further back the supply chain, transportation. So I think there's a lot of excitement about opportunities for land-based workforce and skills transfer into either working waterfront and into some of these processing facilities. But I do think that the conversations are a little bit different between some of the offshore and the onshore communities. I think I just saw a chat come through that my sound quality is not good. So maybe I'll see if I can change that.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll see. I'm not sure if maybe the earbuds aren't quite syncing. I just turned up my volume and I heard you okay, but maybe we check on that. Thanks, Allison. So let's see. In terms of other communities to, you know, Jacob, you talked about the focus on the New Bedford community and your insights and experience there, but I know a lot of your work for Vineyard Offshore is really focused on engaging with tribal governments and members of tribal nations. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about that, understanding we don't have those folks in the room here today on this particular discussion. Hope to, as we continue to expand this discussion, but it's obviously engagement around offshore wind as sovereign nations, tribal nations are engaging in a government to government level discussions around this, but developers like yourselves are also seeking to understand community concerns around or priorities around offshore wind development. And so just hoping you can tell us a little bit more about how you approach this work and what you're learning about how impacts are defined, again, in the positive or negative sense, and how you're working to address those as you learn about them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's like every part of this, this industry, this is a extremely complicated and delicate space to be working in. This week I was at the National Congress of American Indians, and there is a lot of fear, anger, frustration at the federal government and this industry as a whole, from folks in tribal nations, and they have questions that need to be answered, and concerns that need to be addressed. But again, like my comment earlier, I think a lot of this has to be based in trust and relationships and in relation. It makes a lot of sense, for tribal nations to have a lot of questions and concerns about these projects, because the land and the environment has a different meaning in culture. And sorry, my Zoom screen's moving around a little bit, so I got distracted. The land and the environment has, tribal and indigenous knowledge is just a different set of knowledge that needs to be respected and held up to the same level as traditional or Western-based knowledge. Again, those definitions are extremely fluid. So I think that just at the most basic level, seeing tribes and tribal nations not as stakeholders, because they're not. They are sovereign nations, and that they need to be and have every right to be treated as you're working with any form of government or any other sovereign foreign nation. I think that's the most important first step, and really my learning has just been just listening, purely going into spaces to listen, learn, and to understand the experience of folks, because it's a different experience than somebody who grows up in that Western in the Western philosophy of the world. And so it's really about building trust. Showing up is also very critical, even when things get negative and things become challenging. Continuing to show up, continuing to listen. Those are the big things that I've learned, and those are the really important things. I think that if anybody wants to engage in this work, just being willing and ready to continue to show up, not get defensive, and just try to fully understand where people's concerns and issues are. But it's fascinating work for sure, and made some really great friendships and relationships, and a lot of people are teaching me a lot of great things. So I'm grateful to a lot of folks in our tribal nation partners.
Great, thanks. Allison, I know you've done some work on this from the research perspective, particularly in the New England region. Is there anything you want to add, just sort of in general, what your research has shown in terms of the specific concerns and impacts, and maybe opportunities for us all to learn and do better on this front?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly from the research standpoint, a number of scholars and researchers have identified some of the, relationships with the U.S. government and decision making with tribes to be a justice issue. And it's not easily overcome, but we know that some of the processes that we have implemented, our research show that, sometimes those voices can be co-opted, and people who are not members of a tribe, I am not a member of a tribe, will often sometimes co-opt those voices to further their gain and further their positions. And I think that's really important to note in decision making, so that we're really carefully considering what are these narratives around tribal impacts, and are they actually coming from the people who are affected. And I think this is really important as we're thinking about engagement processes and sort of strategies for engagement. I really liked what Jake just talked about continuing to show up when things are difficult, and I really agree with that. And we've seen that to some extent here in Maine with fishing communities. Sometimes those conversations are not easy. And I think, overall, we collectively, industry, government, are well aware of the importance of what we sometimes call meaningful engagement. Well, what does that really mean? Well, I mean, I guess that's opposed to superficial engagement. When I think about engagement with different groups of people, right? We sometimes look at this on a spectrum. If we look back, work as early as the 60s, Shelley Arnstein, they're, talking about the spectrum of civic participation and what does it mean to have meaningful engagement, ranges all the way from really non-participation to different methods of tokenism, all the way up to citizen power. Well, a lot of the engagement processes that we typically use are somewhat tokenizing. So for example, informing of some plans that might be happening, or in public engagement processes, or maybe there's a consultation phase where there's been a decision and then we're informing the public, and maybe there's an opportunity to write back, but the decision has already been made, tend to not feel like meaningful engagement, and they don't really put the power in the hands of the people that are being affected by that decision. And so I do think that this is a time for us to think critically about some of the processes that we might use to engage with communities that might be more vulnerable and maybe don't necessarily have not traditionally had access to the types of consultation processes that have become much more normal in decision making.
Allison, I just want to jump in on that real quick. Sorry, I don't want to get out of the order here, but I really think too, like in any of this work, even in New Bedford, but specifically if folks want to engage in tribal work, is understanding history and trying your best to wrap your mind around the history of place or the history of a group of people. Of course, and the tribal history of this country is awful. It's gruesome, but it's really important to understand. There are tribes that have connections to our projects that are out in the Midwest because of the Trail of Tears and other things and displacement that happen. So understanding those histories, reading, doing that work, I think is incredibly important. Just wanted to add that in to Allison's comments, which
Thanks.
And if I could just piggyback on that for one moment, that is one thing I meant to say, and also got a bit distracted on the sound piece, that there are a lot of communities that are land-based that have historically been offshore communities, and we don't often think about those as offshore communities, and tribes might be one of those communities, but people that have historically used and are increasingly being pushed away from coastal areas or offshore industries still may have generational relationships with coastal areas. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So Ben, I'm going to come to you next. I want to go a little bit more deeply into some of the comments earlier around this idea of like the industry becoming tangible. So all of our panelists today are East Coast based, where this industry has been discussed in many cases for a decade or more. But again, my experience is that folks are focused on a lot of other things. Not many in communities spend their day job every day thinking about offshore wind development. And sometimes it takes a massive ship showing up with components to say, oh, it's here. And so I want to ask you each a question of sort of how do we do the work of helping communities focus on these issues before it's maybe too late? To have input, and how do we help communities to prepare and help shape how the industry unfolds? So Ben, your work in New Jersey, the New Jersey Wind Port, is really interesting in terms of it being developed in a very rural location. And I know that that's something that, as you're trying to develop this as that project, what are some of the distinct issues that you're seeing in terms of impact? How do you maximize benefit, and how do you deal with the challenges of being in a rural place?
Yeah, it is. The location is fairly rural. It's on the far western border of the county, right along the Delaware River, and it's this area of New Jersey, not just Salem County where Lower Alloys Creek is located, where the wind port's being constructed, but even some of the surrounding areas, Cumberland County, Gloucester County. There's a lot of agricultural regions, and there's a lot of farming in those areas. So distance does become an issue for a lot of aspects of this, whether we're talking about finding subcontractors who can do the work and can get to the area, and even finding a workforce that can get to the location to do the work for the project that's ongoing right now. And then on a larger scale, this notion of inclusion and workforce development and all the, I guess, surrounding subjects and topics that are going on within the greater offshore wind discussion that this Windport is a part of. The focus on some of these communities that, oftentimes are kind of left out of conversations and left out of opportunities is a very real subject that is frequently discussed and often addressed across the spectrum of the various folks involved in this, whether it's Tishman, who we work for, the construction managers, or whether state of New Jersey, or even some of the local community organizations that we engage with, whether it's a local chamber of commerce or a social service organization or an educational institution, a vocational school and whatnot. And so, I think of what Jacob was saying, the importance of, building trust in this process, and that really comes with, showing up and really engaging, in person and being there to discuss what's happening, whether it's giving an update on here's where we are in the progress of this construction project, and also being able to directly interact with the folks, whether it's, local municipal government agents or just, community members themselves who are there, who's, they maybe have something they want to address or a question they want to ask. I don't think you can really emphasize strongly enough the importance of showing up and, and being open to engaging and communicating, regardless of whether it's, a positive or a negative, as the others have shared as well.
Thanks. I actually, just realizing the time, I think we're going to transition to a couple of the participant questions. So there's one that popped up in the Q&A that actually is similar to one that I had hoped to ask you all. That's really around the reality is that community perceptions of impact, whether they're positive or negative, sometimes can be influenced by contentious issues and divisive issues. Sometimes misinformation can be at play, and there are emotions, and sort of this discussion can and often is wrapped up in bigger political contexts. How do you address that with the work that you do? What are insights that you have in terms of ways to address these contentious issues that maybe show up in your work at the community level? Allison, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I guess I have a few thoughts on that. I mean, something that is certainly playing out in the Northeast around contentious issues are with respect to fishing communities and the siting of offshore wind, both with respect to projects that have already been identified, as well as sort of the future wind energy areas that the federal government has been discussing and has signaled that there will be leasing. I think, something that I think I'm sounding like a broken record here. One of the things that's come up a few times already is the importance of trust and continuing to show up and having face time. And this is certainly true here with fishing communities. We watched this sort of play out over a couple of years, even through the pandemic, when everything moved to Zoom and we couldn't do FaceTime. We were literally, having Zoom in-person meetings in Zoom, which was really difficult. And I think that there's sort of an erosion of that face-to-face contact when that happens. But regardless, still continuing to show up and having those difficult conversations, I think has gone a long way in helping to establish some of the peer leaders in the communities that might be impacted negatively, and having those peer leaders sort of advocate on behalf of others, even if they might not have been previously in a leadership role. So I think that these ideas of continuing to show up are really important. As a researcher, I sometimes think about contentious issues around these concepts of risk and risk perception. The perception of risk of real versus what we sometimes say, well, maybe that's not an actual issue. From my perspective, and as a researcher, I think that perceived risk is just as important as what we might call actual risk, right? That part of risk is really a social construct. There's a theory, that we call the social amplification of risk, which really just says, people that are important in communities, social actors, use the media to talk about potential risks. And we often influence those conversations by inserting our own words. And, we've seen this play out with a number of challenging issues with offshore wind recently, as well as in the past. And, I think that it's important to note that, as we think about risk, right, we look to our leaders, whether those are government leaders or, sort of self-identified community leaders, to help us understand something that we don't have very much experience with. And the vast majority of people in the United States have not had direct experience with offshore wind. And so we don't very well understand what this means. And we're looking for sort of advice. And, continuing to show up and having FaceTime, I think, is really important, but also, engaging in knowledge exchanges. There are ways that we can continue to talk about what the state of the science is, and rather than just saying, oh, well, we don't have any evidence that that's a problem, doesn't really build trust, right? So I think it's important that our trusted leaders continue to engage and have in-person communication, even when things are difficult.
Great. Thank you. I think I'll ask each of you this. Ben, I know there are certainly contentious issues around the work that you're doing. What are strategies that you use to deal with some of those concerns?
Yeah, it's tough when you're dealing with issues like misinformation. And I think the problem with some of that is that it has a tendency to drown out all the other issues and topics and concerns. It may be the loudest voice in the room, but not necessarily the most important or the most significant. And so again, it really comes down to being able to engage with individuals, organizations, the community at large, on a consistent basis regularly. And, these are things that we're involved in with, the construction management team, with the state of New Jersey, with the NJEDA, holding regular, as Allison was saying, informational sessions, sharing that information, passing along that knowledge, sharing that knowledge to present that to the community members of here's what's going on, does put you in a better position, I think, as far as, the narrative is concerned, other than just, playing defense and trying to shout down the loud reverberations of the misinformation that's out there. And I do want to say that, we do see this frequently, not just with us. I mean, our part in this is relatively small, honestly. We see a lot of the developers, the Orsteds, the Atlantic Shores, they engage regularly, whether it's they just have a draft EIS came out on their project. And so they're going to be holding some public sessions. They're looking for input, and they're doing things in person. They're doing things virtually. They're offering, here you can submit written comments. It's all ways to engage with the community on various levels through various avenues to allow that to occur consistently and regularly. And we see that happening across the board, honestly, which I think will go a long way in the long run to helping to, I guess, distance this project itself from some of the more nefarious, I guess you could say, agendas that kind of get wrought into it.
Thank you. Jacob, any additional perspectives you want to share on this topic?
Yeah, briefly. And I did see the chat come through. Sorry if I've been pinned for people. I don't know what happened there, but I think I think everybody has captured it really well. I think the most important change is hard, and empathy is important, and being able to put yourself in another person's shoes without demonizing them for asking maybe a difficult question or making them feel silly for asking a question that they read some clickbait article about on the internet, whatever it is. It's earnestly listening and showing up, and in the work I do, it's getting to know each other, because that's the only way. It's not a one-way exchange. It's a two-way relationship. And that's how you change people's perspectives, and that's how your own perspective can be changed as you're, as I'm working to develop these projects and this work.
If I can actually just add one little bit too, I just happened to take a scroll through some of the Q&A in the chat that's being put through, and there was an interesting point that was brought up talking about the disparity between the certain communities, like how sometimes it can be pushed out some of the more disadvantaged communities, and this is a very real thing, specifically here in New Jersey. When we're talking about these contentious issues that are coming out and you're reading about, you're hearing about more frequently, especially in the shore-based communities. New Jersey and its coast is it's a tourist destination. Tourism is a massive revenue generator for the state of New Jersey. It's one of the biggest, and there is a lot of discrepancy with who you would, going back to your original question, who would you define as a part of that community? There is the local year-round residents in some of these barrier island towns and cities, but then there's also the folks who come in seasonally. Maybe they have a second home or something like that, or they just come for a week's vacation and stay, or even day trippers. I mean, New Jersey's not that big, so an hour or so in your car and you can have a nice day on the beach. And so it is kind of important to note that recognizing where some of these perspectives are coming from, and maybe hedging that against the relative regional location of some of these other communities, and to not necessarily not to discredit, but to even, I guess, the conversation a bit, and be more inclusive and aware that it's not just you shouldn't focus on the loudest one in the room.
Yeah. I'm really happy you brought that up. I was going to try to fit that question in. We are going to start to wind down our time together. Before we do, there's a few more things we want to cover. I want to ask the final question of each of the panelists, which I hadn't flagged in advance, which is just, we've had some discussion about some of the hard parts of the industry in terms of community. I'd love to hear from each of you within your work, what you think are some of the more resonant positive impacts or benefits of the industry for community. So I'll give you a second to think about that, and in the meantime, just quickly address one of the other questions in the Q&A about community benefits and compensation, and let folks know that Matilda and I and our team at NREL are actually working on a number of resources on this topic that will be posted to the WINDExchange website that we've been talking about today before the end of the summer. So if you're interested to learn more about that, please reach out to us. But we'll have a number of resources based off of some research that the Department of Energy has sponsored us to do on both land-based and offshore wind community benefit agreements. If we didn't directly address one of your questions, we'll be writing up answers to all of them and sending them out to everyone who registered. So if you didn't hear an answer to your question, you will get one in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, before we close out, what do you see as the most resonant positive impacts or benefits for communities in offshore wind based off of the work that you do? Anyone want to go first?
I can go.
Yeah.
I often think about the opportunity, particularly for generational opportunity. In some of my work, I interact with, youth climate justice groups or youth of maritime families in increasingly dire world where there's a lot of bad news in headlines. I think there's really a lot of opportunity, and whether that's in jobs or that's seeing a different future than what the running narrative is right now, which is a lot of doom and gloom on the media. I think there's a lot of excitement about the opportunity. We're in a difficult period right now of change, but I do think that there's really a lot of opportunity for hope. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Ben, Jacob?
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, I'll jump. It's similar, and I did see the question about the negatives, and I'm sorry I didn't touch on some of them more specifically, but I do think that the ability to work on a big thing together in a community. This is a once in a lifetime new industry, and with all of its negatives and positives, is something to be extremely hopeful about, to Allison's point. This industry has the potential to chip away at righting some past wrongs and to do something really big and special for the future generations. So I think for all of the potential negatives of this, just being able to work on this together in communities and be in partnership and collaboration, I think is something very special about this industry going forward.
Ben?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great way to frame it. It's kind of a once in a generation opportunity that we're seeing here with this industry in New Jersey, and specifically in South Jersey. A few decades ago, we stood up the casino industry in Atlantic City, and that brought an incredible amount of job opportunity for a lot of the local residents, whether it was in the construction and building or even just in the operations. And I think the community around South Jersey has gotten a palpable excitement and to a lesser degree curiosity, at least, in this industry and the opportunities that it is primed to bring. They're seeing it real. It's become real now. It was fairly abstract, I think, for a good number of years as this discussion kind of grew, but now they're digging, they're driving piles into the ground, they're moving dirt around, they're building structures, in Paulsboro, right up the river from the Windport is EEW's facility, where they're manufacturing the monopiles that are going to be shipped down the river to the Windport for the complete marshaling and whatnot. And it's real, it's become real. And I think that the interest is and excitement is something that is a very positive sign that will certainly sustain this project for a long period of time.
I want to thank all of the panelists and for all of the participant questions. I'm going to hand it over to Matilda to wrap us up with one final poll and to let you know how we will answer all of your questions. Oh, Matilda, if you're trying to talk, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Suzanne, and hopefully you can see that I'm sharing. So yes, we do have one last poll, and we appreciate people probably have to jump off, but we'll send it out anyway just to see what you think. You should be able to see that popping up now. It's about what kind of resources you would find most helpful for understanding more about offshore wind's community impacts. And I don't actually know if you can see it, so feel free to let me know if it's not coming up, Suzanne.
Yep, people are responding.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
I'm sharing. I'm basically unable to see anything. So in the meantime, I'll say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Dr. Allison Bates, Ben Gallinelli, and Jacob Miller for sharing their perspectives today, and to Suzanne McDonald for moderating the panel. As always, we'd like to thank the Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office for supporting this webinar series and the NREL communications team for all of their help. And thank you to the audience for spending this hour with us and providing your thoughtful questions. As a reminder, we will send out webinar slides, a recording, and a written Q&A in the next month. And please have a good day.